Hi, welcome to this ISMT on-demand session, always iterating Agile project management in the editorial office. Today we have Lindsay Struckmeyer with us and Brian Cody. Lindsay Struckmeyer is an editorial client manager and system support project manager at J&J Editorial, a publishing services company dedicated to providing professional support to editorial offices, publishers, and societies. And Brian Cody is a CEO and co-founder of Scholastica, a web-based software platform providing tools and services for every aspect of publishing academic journals. I just want to also point out that we have the conference app Whova. That's a good place to go for a discussion of the session. If you have any questions or comments for the session, there should be a topic for this session under the community page. Okay, and I'd also like to point out that these speakers both declare no affiliations that could be perceived as posing potential conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brian Cody.
Great, thanks, Craig. Appreciate that. Let me get this set up. All right. So let's dive in. So in this session, Lindsay and I are going to go over Agile principles, how they apply to journal management. We'll share some examples. I'll have some in mind. Lindsay's going to have some more sort of case studies and examples of how this plays out in the editorial office. And then we'll both talk about how to use metrics to identify iterative improvements for journal management. So to start, I want to point out that Agile is a software development framework, not a journal management framework. So I'm borrowing this concept from one sphere, software development, which I have a foot in, and then bringing it to this other sphere, academic journal management. And that kind of borrowing can be really generative for people. It's also, in the end, an analogy. And there's this idea of the frailty of analogy, that when you say something is like something else, that can be really interesting, until you say it's like it in all these ways that it's not, and then the analogy breaks down. So I'm going to try and walk through this in a way that's helpful for you to understand how building software can be relevant and add value to the idea of how you manage a journal, but they're not the same. So I want to say that up front. All right, so if you're not familiar with this acronym, TLDR, so internet acronym, too long didn't read, so this slide is really the punchline. When we look at Agile, it really boils down to figure out a real concrete problem, solve it, see the benefit, then do that again, iterate. So that's the idea. So if you're watching this recording and you're already tired of the sound of my voice and you want to jump ahead to Lindsay's part, at least you've heard the most important thing from me. Okay, if you're still here, I guess we're going to keep going. So Agile is not going to solve all your problems. It's not a panacea. My hope is that learning about Agile, again, will be helpful for giving you some mental tools for thinking about goal setting and problem solving. So related, some problems you probably experience or challenges in your editorial office boil down to politics or personalities or power dynamics, and Agile can't solve those. But what it might help you do is solve and focus on solving problems that are solvable. So to sort of understand constraints and look at those and say, well, what can we do when we can't change those constraints? So here on the left, this left triangle is a model representing the idea of traditional software development. It was called waterfall, or I guess still is called waterfall. So the idea is you figure out your scope, and that's fixed at the top. And many of you might be familiar with, if you're developing an RFP, the scope is where you say, here's, pages 4 through 12, where we say exactly everything we want the software we're going to purchase to do. And so that, as that gets bigger, then the resources and time, so the resources either for someone to build that for you or how long it takes them given how many developers they have, gets bigger. And so generally this idea is you define everything up front, and all those definitions then dictate the resources and time needed. And so when you look at a project, when you're starting, the scope at the top is very fixed and very defined, and the further away you get from that, the more estimated it is, and generally that also means the less accurate it is. That the scope can be very accurate, but then the resources and time will be less accurate, i.e. software always takes way longer to build than you think it is. On the right is this idea of Agile. And so in the 1970s, this started coming about, and it's, over those next 30 years, it's really become the dominant way of building software. And the way this works is, rather than trying to build everything, you start with, what are our resources and time? And a very common way to do this is say, what can we build in the next 2 weeks and finish? And so if you think of it that way, that changes the scope. So you say, well, we have 5 people on our team in 2 weeks. Here's all the things we could think about, but some of those are not going to be accomplishable in this time frame. And so you want to prioritize and pick the thing that you can finish. Sometimes that's taking a big thing and breaking off a chunk, but a core principle is you will finish it. So that might be a way to log into the software. Now, when you log in, there's nothing there. So again, all you've done is a login, but the idea is you can finish that. And so you ship that. So the scope is again defined by how many people and how long you have, and that determines what you can do. So it's a little bit about saying the scope can be realistic. So this was a AJE video presentation they did, and so it's great. I would recommend it. But part of this is saying, you think about what are your goals and what can we ship now. There's this phrase many of you have heard around, don't let perfection be the enemy of good. So the idea is you might have an ideal, but if that's going to take years to accomplish or would require you getting buy-in from so many people in your organization that it's daunting to even get started, it might never happen. Think about putting that on the shelf and taking part of it and saying, well, if I can get this part that adds the most value or adds a lot of value and make that happen, that's a big win. And so start making progress towards those goals. So one example, people think about, oh, I have an ideal kitchen. And sometimes the ideal kitchen, when you really start thinking about what that would take, it's $150,000, and that, is not realistic or sort of will never happen. And that's different than, well, what part of that could you start doing today? Or what's a part you could do? If you're a DIYer, you might think, what could I do this weekend that at least gets me closer to that? I want to put in crown molding, and I could do that in a weekend. If you want to do that, I guarantee you, having done it, it will actually take multiple weekends, but the idea is there. So with Agile, one of the ideas is trying to ship things. I use that word a lot, ship. It's sort of, a shipping container, but the idea is it actually goes out from what your idea and what you're working on to impacting real life. And Agile is this idea of getting things out to real people faster by doing it in chunks. And so the core idea is if you have that RFP with 100 items and it takes 2 years to sort of build, implement, execute, if you can go the Agile route where you would ship, for example, 2 small pieces a week, every week you actually get a small benefit. And so when you're 6 months in, you've had 52 pieces of that shipped, versus in the traditional way, 6 months in, there's no change, right? Everything's still being built. You don't experience any of the benefit. So that's the core of what Agile is. So let's talk about, does this make sense for your team? When we think about Agile, if you're someone where people are going to be comfortable sort of celebrating, hey, there was this benefit. Oh, I hated doing that, and clicking this task or filling out the spreadsheet, or the way we handled copy edits was the worst. I'm really excited that that's a little bit better. That's a really sort of strong, that mentality would really fit well with Agile. Now by the way, as I talk about the slide, all this is really about personalities and team makeup. If you're realistic with yourself, you might have this other side, so the con under Agile, which is if your team is more likely to feel like, well, sure, that's a little better, but we still have all these problems. And that idea of sometimes these have been problems for so long and they're so agitating to people that fixing one thing almost can make some people feel like you're now ignoring or going to downplay the other problems. They feel like I've been asking for this to change for years, and instead you changed this other thing, which isn't my issue. And so in that sort of environment, making small improvements can activate those concerns, and that's a challenge. Looking at waterfall, if it's something sort of mission critical, and sometimes that's involving finances or a publishing model, that RFP model, or that we need a full solution, so this is really solved. Another example I think a lot about is billing or something like that, where if you get it wrong, it adds work for tons of people, right? Accountants, your contract, your managers, the customer, sort of everyone involved is annoyed, right? That's something you kind of want to get right and not make small improvements if you know that it could lead to these unintended consequences. On the flip side, I think a lot of people think about this idea of, well, have an ideal solution, but they know the organizations doesn't have the resources, or they're not going to get the buy-in to do that realistically. So, you have an initiative, and sometimes the organizations, you just don't have time. The editors, the journal managers, your vendors, there's just not the resources to sort of spend 6 months doing something. And I would say that should actually push you to think, if that feels like it describes you, that should push you to think maybe we should try an agile approach. Is take that idea, pick out one thing that would add value, try and get that out there, because then everyone wins and you actually did get a benefit, versus feeling like this better idea will never happen. Well, then there's no benefit. Let me go to the next slide. There we go. So an example this might help with is, many people, when they're doing a New Year's resolution, or depending on how you're doing with this global pandemic, if you're thinking, okay, I've been inside a lot, I need to finally, figure out running with a mask or something like that. But people have these resolutions about getting healthy. And so often that starts with, I'm going to sign up at a gym, or nowadays, again, it's stay away from people and go running, but I'm going to eat healthy. I'm going to do, smoothies. In the morning, I'm going to cook more so I have less saturated fats. And the idea is they want to do all of that. And on day 3, when one of those misses, you ordered takeout, or you didn't feel like working out, it feels like you failed, because the goal was to have this healthy lifestyle with all of these pieces. So I'm going to contrast that. So that would be waterfall. Here's all the things we need to do. So I'm going to contrast that with an agile approach, which would be, say, well, my goal is to be healthy or healthier. What's one thing I can do? And if you work out that day, that's a success. You sort of shipped that improvement. And then the next day, if you cook, that's an improvement. And so the idea is you think of it more in the unit analysis of, is this beneficial, versus it all being coupled. And if it's not all right and working, then it's a failure. So again, there's going to be aspects of the journal management world where this makes more sense. And I'll give some examples, and Lindsay has some really good ones, I think, for thinking about when there are opportunities to do this, and when it's to be agile and when maybe it's not. So if you want to take an agile approach, things you should do is, make sure you're thinking about your goals and moving towards them. Great. They need to be concrete. So an example would be, sometimes people's goals are, I wish this was easier, or I wish this was streamlined. I wish our peer review process was better. That's difficult to break down into agile, because sometimes by better, there's this amorphous sense of all these things that are wrong. And I would say, well, pull back and list out the things that are wrong, and then take one of those and say, well, how do we make that right? And so that's one challenge, is if it's not concrete, then it's really hard to sort of ship an improvement. Also, if it's not concrete, it tends to feel bigger. This isn't right. This is, not streamlined. It's inefficient. It's hard to fix inefficiency. It is easier to fix a specific inefficiency. Okay, and so on the don't side, if you think of everything you want to do and say, I'm going to be agile, and here's the 26 things I want to ship, one sort of philosophy in Agile is, each time you do something, you learn a little bit, and you also change the environment. So think about how you manage your workflow, all the different steps. If you say up front, okay, I'm going to redo these 26 steps. When you redo that, you might realize, when I change step 13, that actually means we don't need 14. So I shouldn't have spent the time redoing that. And that can happen a lot, is as you sort of change it, you need to make sure you're learning. So so under Agile, you would instead say, figure out that one thing, improve it, look at what the world looks like now, or what your journal workflow looks like, and then do the next improvement, versus listing them all out up front. And again, the last one, the sort of challenge of waterfall, don't bring that into Agile. So don't say, well, I thought of all these improvements, and every one of them I know why they would never work. Or that's worth doing, but then each one say, well, is there any part of that I can ship? Because even a small win is a win. And that, I think, for many of us is difficult, because if you feel like, but I know if I did it this way, that would actually be better, but I'm not going to get the buy-in from our editors, or I'm not going to get, we don't have the time to actually do that well. Yeah, you can't change that. And so don't get overwhelmed. Okay, so let's talk about some examples. So we worked with a client, and we were talking with them, and for them, their challenge was they felt like they didn't have enough staff to manage all the manuscripts. They were getting more. I'll note, we sort of do software. We don't do consulting. So all of these experiences I'm having are really from talking through with people, editors, or journal editors, or managing editors, or publishing staff, because we're talking about something and they sort of start sharing their challenges. And because we do have software for what they're using, we're usually very interested in, okay, can we help with that? So in this example, they were sort of sharing they just didn't have time to manage all the manuscripts. I was asking, oh, why is that? Well, they only have so much staff, and the journal's one of the projects. The managing editor working on that journal, that wasn't their only role. They had another journal, and they had other responsibilities for their job. It was a hybrid role, and I think that's probably familiar to many people in the journal world. There were, again, more and more manuscripts. There were, when I started saying, well, what actually takes up time, some of the issues came up was, whenever emails come in, putting them into the right folder for the right journal, sometimes the right issue if it was relevant, thinking about issues they might want to archive or keep on record, updating spreadsheets so they knew where everything was, their publication schedules, and sort of making sure everything stayed in sync. That if something came back from copy editing, they had sent it out, they had the email saved, they'd updated the spreadsheet, and they had told everyone. And then, so we kind of went through that. And for them, when you frame the problem as not enough staff time, they were really focused on what could we do to get more people. And in the organization, that wasn't realistic. There wasn't the budget for that. So in talking, we sort of reframed the problem from staff to, not enough staff, to it's a time and task problem that, or at least that is the part of it we could fix. It'd be great to have more people, but we can't do that. So what can we do? Well, the way you're describing it, there's lots of things that have to happen and stay in sync. What can we do? So one of these was a tweak, was saying, well, one of the tools you're using, your peer review system organizes the manuscripts. Can you add data there versus having a separate spreadsheet? Because then at least that way there's, less things to get out of sync, and you're already using one a lot. And that was a small win. It was using this idea of tags instead of having a separate sort of spreadsheet with some data. Another one was there was a tool in our software that included email. When they started using that, it automatically organizes emails. And again, I don't want to go into that too far, but it was a tool that was available to them that they weren't using. And if you're using a peer review platform or production platform, I would always encourage you to reach out to that vendor and sort of walk through what you do now, because they will often say, oh, there's a tool we rolled out. And if you've been using it for years, they might have added stuff that you don't even know about that could sort of cut out some of those inefficiencies. So no, this did not solve all their problems. There's still a lot to do, more manuscripts. What they did see is specifically the email part. When you think about, if you have hundreds of manuscripts, each manuscript comes with, dozens of emails from the author, the copy editor, all the reviewers. Just putting those into folders they were doing that thousands, and it might have been tens of thousands times a year. So cutting that out was, I think, a win time-wise. It's also just doing routine rote tasks, manual tasks over and over is also a morale killer. And I think that was a win that we didn't really discuss till afterwards, that just felt like, the work they were doing was more substantive and not as much time was spent on things that they felt like, was just moving stuff into folders. Okay, another example. The editor was, I think this might have been the managing editor, was talking about that tracking assignments felt really unorganized. And they framed it that way, which I appreciated, is that they didn't feel like it was at the level of professionalism or organization that they would like. And I'll just say, that's a hard thing to solve. Feeling like it's not organized feels like a big project. How do you rethink everything? So we talked through what they're actually doing. They have all these editors. Many of you might experience this, editors across different time zones. The editors, or the managing editor, had different spreadsheets for the different journals. Some editors worked on multiple journals. They were sending emails to sort of remind them about things they need to do. And one of the main pain points when we really sort of dug deep was that things are slipping through the cracks, and the fear of things slipping through the cracks was really stressful. And the managing editor didn't like nudging editors, and felt like it was pretty frequent to say, "Hey, I emailed you about this 2 weeks ago. Can you do this?" And we actually talked to some of the editors, and there was this flip side, which was realistically, they were saying, "Look, we get so many emails. Yeah, stuff's going to slip through the cracks. That's it." And so that helped reframe it from, the process is unorganized, which is a big project and would really on some level need a lot of changes to email overload. And we started taking an agile perspective and saying, well, what can we ship on that? This was one, again, we're a software company, so we love building stuff to solve problems. But I'll note, the solution I'm going to say, so using a to-do system so that editors can see the same tasks the editor has. So that's the thing, is the editor had a spreadsheet and was translating into email. If you have a task list, everyone can see, for example, go in and see, what are Brian's tasks? I can follow up by email, but I'm always saying, look, there's a source of truth you can go look at. And there's apps like HighTask, or I use something called Todoist. Teams can use all sorts of to-do management apps, but that idea of you can have fewer emails because all the things that are in the email live somewhere people can go find. And so the editor started doing, I think, more of a weekly digest and would follow up if things were urgent, but it really reduced the amount of emails, because editors could also get a nudge saying, hey, can you go work on your overdue tasks? And that's one email, which could represent many, many things. So that was helpful for them. This is one I think if you're at sort of a publisher or press level, this might be, feel familiar, is, the problem the publisher talked about is all their journals are using different software platforms. And so for them, the idea is if they could all use one software platform, that would be better. And I asked sort of, well, why? Well, they sort of said, journals come on and they were using software and they've switched publishers. And so the publisher kind of inherits that. It means all the staff have to learn multiple platforms. They're using Scholar One and Editorial Manager and Scholastica and whatever other system. And then also when questions come up from a reviewer, they have to do work to think, okay, where does this go? Who do we send this to? Can I answer it? Do I need to double check the help docs? They just felt like triaging and sort of normal work was branched out so much that it was stressful. So in talking with them, again, the idea of, can we get one system? That's a big project. I think they had over a dozen journals, might have had 24. And the idea of switching all of them just felt like, when are they going to have time and the focus to spend a year changing out software and moving every journal over? And so instead, what we talked about was, look, you're using many software platforms. A win is to get down to fewer, and that's just a different way. And sort of in talking about it, what they saw was, I forget the number, but let's say it's 5. They're using 5, all the journals, 5 software systems. Well, they saw one journal was the only one using one platform. So if they worked in that journal and got them to switch to any of the other platform, any of the other software, they went from 5 to 4. So that's a 20% decrease. That's a big win without having to think, how do we get every journal onto everything? And so that's, again, a different way to think about it. It's a more agile one, where it was, this is an improvement, it feels shippable. And I think they're continuing to iterate on that, but I think they no longer have the idea of get everyone onto one platform, but look for opportunities for some consolidation and sort of always be looking at that every quarter, every 6 months, every year. Can you get closer to that goal? And I think their team was really good at that. Their team is very good at sort of being excited about, oh, we realize next year 2 more journals are going to switch to this, and that way this managing editor will only have to deal with one system. Even though all the other managing editors have to deal with lots, one person's world got better. And that was a win for them. So it's a good example to think about. Lindsay will talk more about this idea of metrics. Just some examples that I think about is, there's this idea, and Origin Editorial had a piece about this, but you want data to manage your to make your decisions and priorities. As Lindsay will talk about, sometimes you can't get sort of our ideal data set. And so, but what you have to be careful about is having no data, is having people saying, this is bad, or this takes forever, and not having at least some number to like check that. So with Agile, we encourage you, look for that idea of a concrete problem. So example, time on technical checks, the time to review. But even those, you have to break out, right? There's more in there. And I'll kind of stop here because Lindsay's going to take some examples and sort of break them out into their different pieces and say, if you think about this as a big problem, it's really hard. If you break it into 6 steps and think about where can we improve any of those steps, it's an agile approach, and it might be a little easier to sort of make an improvement. Whenever you look at the data, trying to prioritize is really hard. And one thing with agile is sometimes the priority might be too big for your resources. But you prioritize and say, here's our top 10 in order. 1 and 2 are too big. Number 3 is doable. And for some people, that's gonna be really disappointing. I call that a win, which is one of your top 10 things got fixed or is being fixed. So I encourage you to to think of it that way, and think of a prioritized list doesn't mean 1 bucket of 10. It really means number 4 is more important than number 5. And anything you do in that list, you try and always start at the top, but if you can't, the thing you can ship is a win. This is sort of stepping that, but the 3 steps: identify a single improvement, get an actionable metric that'll tell you if it got better. Some of the examples I gave, the time spent organizing emails. Well, if you can stop doing it, it's pretty easy, as you went from however much time to 0. But sometimes it's saving 50% time, or reviewers, right now take 3 weeks longer than we asked them. And if we can get down to 2 weeks, that'll be really helpful. And then track and iterate. So think about it every 6 months. Make an improvement, get some data, see if there's something else you want to do. Again, one thing that we encourage people to do is make sure it's easy to get data. So not just in our software, but as a company, like our team members at Scholastica, we try and always have performance data where it's refreshed as much in real time, or at least daily, and that you can see patterns. Because the idea is, if you make an improvement, being able to see improvement over the next week, 2 weeks, month feels really good. If you make an improvement and you're only going to know when you do your annual sort of report where you get all your numbers, sometimes it's not going to be visible, and you're not getting the proof that it worked. So that's something to try and do, is have the data. So I'll stop here. And like I said, Lindsay's going to go into some great examples that'll build on this, but hopefully that was a helpful introduction to Agile. And let me stop sharing.
All right, thanks, Brian. I'm going to share my presentation here. So I'm really excited to talk about some very specific ways that you can put this Agile project management mindset into practice. So the first thing that I want to talk about are 2 different ways that you can identify those problem areas. The first being that hard data that's so important. You want to run your report so you can find that actual data, and then analyze it, and then determine what the root of that problem is, and develop a specific strategy to solve that one specific problem. I am going to also talk about anecdotal data. I know that Brian warned that this can be the enemy of effective editorial office management. I certainly don't disagree with that, and I very much want to warn against changing your whole workflow because one author complained about something one time. But with anecdotal situations, you can sort of track those. Was it one author complaining one time, or was it, multiple authors and reviewers complaining 3 times a week for a year? So there are some ways that you can look at that anecdotal data in a more systematic way. And you want to pay attention to that anecdotal information, maybe from your editors, your authors, reviewers, your publisher, society, your readers, and maybe most importantly, yourself. What are you and your coworkers experiencing? We're going to talk about several examples of common problem areas, but I do want you to remember that, again, we're encouraging you to only look at one problem at a time and solve it in an agile manner. So don't get overwhelmed with all the specific examples that I'm going to be showing you. I do want to talk about time to decision, but I want to talk about its individual components. So as we know, time to decision is made up of many different factors. Time to for staff to do a technical check, editor assignment, associate editor assignment, reviewer invitation, review submission, editor decision, and then staff processing. So instead of looking at time to decision as a whole, if we're looking at it from an Agile perspective, we really want to break down those individual components and tackle only the ones that are problems and only one at a time. We're also going to talk about problem areas in terms of reviewers, editors in your editorial board, your instructions for authors and your submission process, your article types, submission system updates, and just generally other pain points that might be factors. First of all, when we're talking about reviewers, you can run a report to look at several different factors that might be an issue with your review process. So first of all, looking at your reviewer turnaround times and whether or not your reviewers are frequently late or if they're generally on time. If they are frequently late, this is probably a factor that is affecting your time to decision. So one thing that you can do is to implement more automated reminders or perhaps incorporate more personal reminders, whether those be from the editorial office or maybe you're encouraging your editors to send a personal reminder, which might actually be more effective than editorial office reminders. Another thing to look at is your reviewer response rates. So maybe you have a high decline rate, which means that reviewers are manually and actively declining to review. In this case, you want to think about why that might be happening. So is this because perhaps the reviewers aren't getting manuscripts that are in their area of expertise? They're not interested or they're not an expert on that manuscript. If so, you might consider updating your list of classifications or keywords that are available for manuscripts and reviewers, and then ask your reviewers, whether it be in a batch email or some sort of other campaign, to update their account information so that you can better send them manuscripts that match their area. The other issue that might be happening here is a high no response rate, which means that they're getting automatically uninvited by the system because they haven't responded to the invitation. So maybe your emails are bouncing and that's why they're not responding. So you might want to find a way to either remove those outdated emails or deactivate inactive accounts of folks that haven't been reviewing lately. Another problem might be that the review invitation isn't very enticing. So maybe you spice up that subject line or the text of the email to make the reviewer more likely to reply and hopefully agree. You might also want to look at your reviewer ratings. So perhaps you are getting a lot of reviewers that are returning your reviews, but they're not very good reviews. In this case, you might want to look into providing more reviewer resources or guidelines or instructions that will help them submit a review that matches and meets your standards and the different areas that you want them to really focus on in their review. Another thing to look at that I think people don't think about a lot is your total invitations versus your unique reviewers. So if you're sending out 1,000 invitations, are you sending those 1,000 invitations to 800 people or to 100 people? Are your reviewers getting 10 reviews or 1 or 2 reviews? Do you have a lot of reviewer fatigue? And if so, you might just be burning out your best reviewers. In this case, we would recommend running another report to find those reviewers who are maybe underutilized or completely unutilized and bring them to the attention of your editors so that they can invite those folks. You might also want to consider ways that you can involve the next generation of reviewers. So folks who are fellows or residents, early career researchers who can help to sustain your reviewer pool for the future. I also want to talk about this world of COVID that we're living in. This is another area that you really might want to focus on, especially at this time. I want to talk about reviewers and submissions in particular, but I think that every journal is experiencing a somewhat unique set of circumstances right now, especially depending on the subject matter of your journal. So a thing that we're seeing very commonly is that our reviewer invitation responses are either much higher or much lower than normal. And that might change from month to month or even from week to week. So we do recommend tracking either on a weekly or monthly basis your pre and post COVID reviewer invitation responses to see if reviewers are agreeing or declining more than usual. This may be because, your reviewers have more time or less time due to their particular responsibilities in their hospital or university. So that is something that you might want to take into account. Similarly, you want to look at their turnaround times. Are they really on time right now, or are they exceptionally late? I'm commonly seeing more reviewers are agreeing, but then those reviewers tend to be more late than usual. In these sort of cases, we're making decisions like extending the time that reviewers have to both submit a review and respond to an invitation, and we are either increasing or lengthening our automated reminders in ways that we think will be more considerate or helpful to our reviewers. We want to sort of respect their commitments and availability right now, while also, making sure the journal stays on track. Similarly with submissions, I would recommend tracking either monthly or maybe weekly your specific COVID-related submissions, especially in relation to your general non-COVID related submissions. This might tell you that you're having, a huge influx or decrease in submissions that might affect your staff's time and your editor's time as well. And tracking the acceptance and rejection rates of those COVID submissions. Maybe you're getting 100 a week, but you're only accepting 1 a week. So that might be something that you want to take steps, enact instructions, or more specific submission instructions or something like that. You might also want to track the article types of the COVID-related submissions that you're receiving, specifically whether they are research focused or maybe more editorial commentary type articles. And that might just help you get a sense of, what you're receiving and what you are interested in publishing based on the content, of course. So looking at your editors and your editorial board, there's a lot of things that you can look at here. First is their timeliness and performance. So if you have any underperformers who sort of maybe aren't holding up the standards of the journal, is it time to roll them off, or perhaps for the editor-in-chief or the society or the publisher, whoever might be most appropriate, to have a conversation about their availability and commitment to the journal? Similarly, maybe there is a way that you can develop more effective or more reminders to the editor so that you can better support them. So for example, if you have some editors who do most of their work on the weekends, maybe that Monday reminder isn't as helpful as a Friday reminder would be, and you just need to make some adjustments there. You can also look at the quality of the number of assignments your editors are receiving. So for example, maybe you have a star associate editor who is in turn really overburdened with the majority of submissions. So you might look at parsing out those assignments in a more equal fashion. You also might look at the areas of expertise that are represented. So for example, if you have 10 associate editors who are focusing on 10 different areas in your subject matter, you might look and see if 1 or 2 of those areas, and if we're editors, are receiving the most submissions. Maybe there's something you can do to give them more support add more editors in to handle that particular focus or topic, or maybe you are not receiving very many submissions for a particular topic at all, and that editor is maybe no longer needed or can be folded into another topic somehow. Another really important thing to look at is the diversity of your board, particularly from a gender and a racial balance perspective, to make sure that there's really good representation and equality on your board. I think this is something that can be overlooked sometimes, but it's really important to make sure that your editorial board is as diverse as it can be. Another thing that I think is also often overlooked is global representation. So whether you are maybe a US-based journal or an international journal, looking at where your editors come from can be really helpful. So if you're US-based, is everybody in California or the East Coast, are you getting good overall representation from the whole US? And, similarly, from a global perspective, is everyone from one or two continents? Do you need to reach out to more areas of the world? Something else that you can think about in this situation is where your submissions are coming from. If 30% of your submissions are coming from China, do you have enough editors from China who can help give you the perspective from that part of the world? So here we're getting more into an anecdotal look at the journal. So again, we want to track this anecdotal data as best as we can so that we are sure that we're making changes for the right reasons. So in terms of auditing your instructions for authors in the submission process, you want to first identify your issues by tracking them as best you can. So maybe tracking how often you're sending back or unsubmitting a manuscript for a particular change and what that change is. So if no one's adding page numbers or everyone's missing something from the title page, maybe that information just needs to be made more clear in the submission instructions. Similarly, you might want to track what kind of queries you're getting. Do you get the same question over and over from authors and reviewers? If so, maybe there's just a way that you can make that information more visible or available to them where they need it so that they don't have to take the time to email you and you don't have to take the time to email them back. So here it can be really helpful to read those instructions from the author's perspective and think about ways that you can make the information maybe more visible or organize it in a way that would be more helpful. So sometimes something as simple as like a bulleted list, checklist, headings, bold text, red text, something like that can help bring information that's already available more to the author's attention. But sometimes that information just needs to be added in. It's not there in the first place. One thing that you can actually do is try to submit a paper from an author's perspective or even a review from a reviewer's perspective. I think a lot of times it's very obvious from an editorial office standpoint, but that doesn't mean it's obvious to an author or reviewer who don't do this as often as we do. I've also heard of people who sort of get a friend or a loved one to do this from a completely neutral perspective and then give you feedback. That's something that can be very, very helpful. But just to make sure those submission questions are effective, they're not annoying or burdensome, the instructions are clear, and maybe there are any further resources or links or forms that can be added to make the process easier. Something that I also think is commonly overlooked is your article types, but this can be something that can really help your editorial office and your journal in general. So looking at your impact factor data, you can usually very specifically look at how your research versus non-research article types might be serving the journal and therefore the impact factor. I know we all just got our impact factors pretty recently, so that's something that you might be considering now for the coming years. But you also might consider your reader's perspective. So the impact factor is not always the most important thing if you want to serve your readers. Whereas non-research articles don't always improve your impact factor, they can usually benefit clinicians tremendously. So you want to make sure that your article types are serving your readership, and that can be done through surveys. You also might want to consider what article types are actually active and inactive right now. So think about both your instructions for authors and your submission system. Are there article types that you've discontinued in practice, but not removed from your submission system or your instructions for authors? Removing these, make sure it's always cleaned up and accurate, can really help cut down on confusion from authors and cut down from any submissions or email queries that you're getting and then have to deal with. Doing a submission system audit can really help from an Agile perspective. So again, a lot of times this is anecdotal, but you as from the editorial office, you know what your pain points are. You know which parts of your workflow are always a headache or take way more time than they need to. If that's the case, think about the last time that you implemented a new feature. Was that 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Was it when you got on the submission system? If so, or even if it was, a year ago, there's probably new features out there that are available that can make your life easier. So you might want to think about getting on a mailing list from the maker of your submission system to learn about new features, or attending webinars that can help you learn about new features. What you particularly want to look for are features that can help you automate a task that you're spending a lot of time doing manually, or maybe even running reports automatically that are emailed to you automatically, so that you don't have to go in, every week or month or what have you, and take your time to create and or just run them manually. So these little changes can often really help your process. So I hope that these examples were very helpful to you. Remember that we encourage you just to take it one step at a time, get your data, make a solution, and then celebrate those successes one at a time. With that, I will turn it back over to Craig. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you everyone for attending, and thank Brian and Lindsay for presenting on this topic. I just wanted to point out again that the Whova app is where you would want to go to pose any questions, and that question topic string will be open until the end of August. So if you think of anything after watching this, please do reach out, and Lindsay and Brian will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you again.